Hello, my name is Chris and today I'd like to talk to you about vaping. Whether or not vaping is a good method of quitting smoking. Before we get into it, I figured it helps if we're on the same page about what we mean when we say quitting smoking. Because to quit smoking cigarettes and to quit smoking altogether can be two different things, especially if a person quits smoking cigarettes but continues to vape long term and just uses the vape in the same way that they used cigarettes, which, that's quitting smoking cigarettes, but it's not quitting smoking, it's just replacing cigarettes, it's just replacing one thing with another and remaining, trapped in that addiction. And I don't just mean addiction to nicotine, because I get that some of the e-liquids that you can vape, you can get nicotine free versions, but even if you use a vape to get rid of, to break the addiction to nicotine, the psychological addiction to the physical act of vaping, of smoking, can remain long term. Possible to stop smoking cigarettes and pick up a vape, but remain in that mindset that every time something happens and I want to change the way that I feel, I have to reach for this external crutch and use it. For some people that might be fine, that might be all that they want. They don't like the way that cigarettes smell or how much they cost or anything like that, but they're quite happy just to swap them for vaping and stay vaping long term, and that's fine. But the kind of quitting smoking that I really try and encourage people to work towards, to embrace, whatever you want to call it, is to have that absolute freedom. I call the Facebook group Finding Freedom, because I want people to find freedom not just from nicotine addiction, but from having to rely on some external crutch every time, whether it's anything from mild discomfort to outright stress, having to use something else. And I know that there are people, in fact I'm pretty sure there are people who have watched my videos and are in the Facebook group who have used a vape to successfully find freedom. They kind of did like a swap and drop thing, where they swapped cigarettes for a vape and then used the vape to taper off their nicotines, using less and less nicotine in their juices, or their e-liquids, whatever you want to call them, until such point where they weren't taking in any nicotine. So having swapped it, they then drop the vape altogether and don't use it, and achieve that long-term freedom. That can be, just as valid a way to quit smoking as, say, using patches, potions, But those people who do that are in the minority compared to the larger number of people who simply replace smoking cigarettes with vaping and never find that true freedom. A study was published earlier this year in February 2019, in which researchers took a group of people, I think it was 900 people, it might have been more than that, and they divided them into two groups, and two groups who were going to quit smoking using different methods. One group attempted to quit smoking by vaping. The other group attempted to quit smoking using traditional NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, so things like patches and gum and lozenges. What they found was that 18% of people who used vaping were able to quit smoking cigarettes, compared to just 10% who used nicotine replacement therapy. So already vaping is winning the argument. It's proved to be nearly twice as effective at helping people to stop smoking cigarettes than traditional nicotine replacement therapy. However, and this is where the story gets interesting, a year after a year later, the researchers went back to these two groups, and specifically to the percentage of people who had been able to successfully quit smoking. So they went back to the 18% of vapers, and they went back to the 10% of nicotine replacement therapy users to see how they were getting on. 80% of those who had quit smoking by vaping were still vaping 12 months later, whereas only 9% of NRT users were still using the patches, the pills, the lotions, the potions, whatever it was they happened to use. So what we can deduce by this is that yes, vaping might be, helpful at getting people to break off from using cigarettes, but long term, other kinds of nicotine replacement therapy have a better effect at helping people to break free from using any external crutch, any external source to help them enjoy complete freedom from their addiction. So what we deduce from that study is that if you quit smoking by vaping, then you are far more likely to stay vaping long term than you are if you use NRT to still be using NRT long term. Again, that might be fine for some people if all you want to do is swap one thing for the other. It's your life, you can make that decision. But I would encourage you, someone who's completely broken free and enjoys complete freedom today, I would certainly encourage you to do that. But of course, if there's a greater chance that you're just going to remain addicted to vaping, then why are so many of us talking about vaping as a method of quitting smoking in the first place? I think it has at least something to do with the way that vaping is sold to us. It's sold as like a quite exciting and an even sexy way to quit smoking, especially compared to patches and nicotine gum and things like that. Given the option, you can take this boring ass patch and you can slap it on your arm and that's about as good as it gets. Or you can take this really fancy gadget that looks cool and it lights up and it sings and it dances, and you can put all these flavours in. You can have blueberry, blackcurrant, bacon, brilliance. You can take the whole of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory condensed into a liquid and take it into your lungs, and it's just an absolute treat. That's the way that vaping is kind of sold to us, whether consciously or subconsciously. That's what we think of. When I go into town, every other shop that I go past is like some kind of vaping store, and people are sat there chilling out like it's a coffee shop in Amsterdam or something. And so that means it makes sense why people are attracted to this idea of vaping, right? I also find it interesting that when you go online and try to look for, you can find a lot of evidence, as I'll share with you later, of why vaping might not be as good as people make out. But when you look for the positives, when you look for reinforcement as to, okay, why is vaping good for quitting smoking, 90% of the content online that tells you vaping is good for quitting smoking comes from people who are trying to sell you vape pens and liquids and all the wonderful accessories that go along with them. Now I know you could say that about anything, right? Like that's just clever marketing. If the people who make nicotine gum are going to tell you that it's good. The people who make Champix are going to tell you that it's good. But I found that there are far more independent, impartial organizations, companies, websites, whatever, that will advocate for nicotine replacement therapy or going cold turkey than there are, for using vaping. Most public health organisations, most charitable organisations don't recommend using a vape pen in the way that they recommend other NRT. There is of course one big exception to that rule, and that is Public Health England, who are an organisation in my country here in the UK who support the work that the NHS does, and they run campaigns about various health topics. And they even launched a campaign to say, look, if you're trying to quit smoking, why not try vaping? And they said, yeah, it's a really good thing to do. They definitely recommend using vaping to quit smoking. But interestingly, the NHS themselves, the National Health Service that Public Health England supports, have sort of countered this and say, okay, we take on board what Public Health England is saying, but we prefer to say that, look, vaping, if you choose to vape, you may not be able to quit smoking, but it is a healthier alternative to smoking cigarettes. A healthier alternative, and I want to discuss that word healthier with you. Healthier is a very relative term, right? A single chocolate bar is probably healthier than an entire KFC bucket meal. Smoking a cigarette even is probably healthier than wrapping your lips around the exhaust of your car and sucking all the fumes in. Healthier doesn't necessarily mean healthy, and it certainly doesn't mean harmless. The way that Public Health England came about having this official stance, their official stance on vaping is that yes, it is good for quitting smoking. They came to that conclusion based on research that came out in 2015, which claimed that vaping was 95% less harmful than smoking cigarettes. Now, there has been criticisms of this report and claims that it isn't quite as accurate as, it isn't quite the great news that all vapers were hoping for. The report was criticised by experts and medical journals, not just for the claims themselves, not just, are you sure that's correct, but also Public Health England's professional relationships and funding connections were brought into question. This is not the place to dive into conspiracy theories, although I may do that later because this sounds quite interesting. But questions were raised about, okay, who is, where are Public Health England getting their money from? And is somebody, potentially giving them a backhander to say, go on, tell them that vaping is good. You can make of that what you will. But the big thing that I'm concerned with is that most of the claims in this report that vaping is 95% less harmful comes from the fact that there are fewer chemicals in e-liquid. We take in fewer toxic chemicals when we vape than we do when we smoke cigarettes. But in this case, quantity and potency aren't the same thing. There may be fewer chemicals in e-liquid, in vape juice, than there are in cigarettes, but the stuff that is in, the stuff that we inhale when we vape is still not good for us. Of course, there's nicotine itself. Well, nicotine is not just physically addictive, it also raises our blood pressure, raises our heart rate, raises our risk of having a heart attack. Now, counter argument to that, yes, I know, as I said earlier, it is possible to vape without to use e-liquids that have no nicotine in them. So even if you take vaping out of the equation, even if you take nicotine out of the equation, there are still harmful chemicals that we inhale when we do vape. The liquids that we use in vaping contain chemicals called propylene glycol and glycerol, which when heated up to the temperature that we need to vape, produce formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is a carcinogen, which means it is capable of forming cancer in the body. In 2015, researchers from the University of Portland, they did some research and they found that the levels of formaldehyde in e-cigarettes and used in e-liquids were anywhere between 5 to 15 times higher than the levels of formaldehyde found in cigarettes. And formaldehyde itself isn't, at least may not be the only carcinogen found in e-liquids, may not be the only carcinogen that we take in when we vape. 2 years later, in 2017, researchers from the University of California did a study where they looked at the urine of people who used e-cigarettes. And they found in the urine of people who vaped, there were at least 5 of the same carcinogens that you would find in that of someone who smoked cigarettes. Elsewhere, other research studies have shown that when the e-liquid comes into contact with the metal coil that is part of the vape, it becomes contaminated with things like nickel and lead and all kinds of other toxic chemicals that can be harmful to us when we ingest them and inhale them. And also that some of the chemicals used to flavour the e-liquid can cause us harm. They might be harmless, the same chemicals used to flavour e-liquids are also used to flavour some of our foods. They can be harmless when we eat them, but again when heated up and inhaled can impair our heart function. So there is a lot of evidence, and there seems to be a lot more evidence coming forward to suggest that vaping isn't quite as harmless and it isn't quite as safe as we were once told that it could be, or that it should be, or that it is. I admit that was a lot of information to throw at you, but it was my hope that if I share with you the things that I have learned about vaping, then you can better make your own informed decision about whether or not vaping is a good idea for quitting smoking. Personally, I would suggest that knowing what we know now about the way that vaping can affect us, the damage that it can cause us, and it can cause us damage despite what some people might tell you, there are healthier ways to quit smoking than vaping, especially if we are far more likely to just replace cigarettes with vaping rather than break the addiction altogether and enjoy long-term freedom. However, having said that, like I said earlier, I am aware that people are able to use vaping successfully and use it as a short-term tool and not a long-term replacement. And I'm certainly not going to say to anyone, hey, if you quit smoking by vaping, then you're doing it wrong and you're a disgraceful human being. Not at all. As I've said in other videos, my method or my message, as much as I have one, is for people to find a way of enjoying their freedom and do what works for them. Personally, I would recommend taking it one step at a time. one day, one step, one good decision at a time. If this is the first of my videos you've ever watched, please do dive deep into my channel. We have dissected this quit smoking thing from every conceivable angle so far, and we will continue to do so. So if vaping may not be right for you, I've talked about nicotine replacement, Champix, cold turkey, taking exercise, doing all of those things. If you're a regular viewer, I want to say thank you once again for coming hanging out with me. I really, genuinely do appreciate your support. If you'd like to further support this channel, you can do so by going to chrisscoyles.com/support or patreon.com/chrisscoyles. On Patreon, I'm going to share a whole bunch of new content over the next couple of weeks. I'll be taking a few days off this weekend to record a whole bunch more stuff exclusively for Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. I genuinely do appreciate you being here. Likes, comments are always appreciated. Let me know how you're getting on your journey. Until next week, I'll see you then. Goodbye.